throughout this week is that in the very last two parshiot of the book of Shemot, Hashem and Moshe Rabbeinu discusses and meets out all of the details in regarding the contributions and the construction and so on and so forth of the Mishkan. However, as we noted several times throughout this week, the last two parshiot are given to Bnei Yisrael after Moshe Rabbeinu comes down from Mount Sinai. However, the previous parshiot prior to that, Parshat Terumah and Parshat Tetzaveh, already spelled out all the nitty-gritty details. Why does the Torah see it fit to seemingly repeat the same details where everything was already meted out in prior parshiot, especially to the fact that we know that the Torah never repeats itself. So if the Torah seemingly repeats itself, it means that there is teaching something altogether different. And we discussed that according to one of the commentaries, we're talking about two different Mishkanim. There is the heavenly tabernacle and the netherworld tabernacle. And with this in mind, we opened up a deeper question, which is, why would Hashem need a physical tabernacle when the heavenly tabernacle gets it perfect? It's created by an angel, and there's no ego involved, and there's no limited material. Everything in heaven is infinite. Why would Hashem, as the Midrash tells us, abandon the heavenly Mishkan, the heavenly tabernacle, for the sake of the netherworld Mishkan? In other words, if it's light that Hashem is seeking, then there's infinite light in Shemayim. While over here in our world, everything is essentially limited, time and space. And then when you inject the human condition into that, well, that altogether exponentially complicates things. And yet, at the same time, the question that encapsulated the entire discussion was surrounded around a discussion in the Talmud regarding the concept could human beings get measurements perfect? And as we discussed in yesterday's class and the class right before that, the Talmud agrees that we cannot get measurements perfect. If that's the case, then why did Hashem mete out a tabernacle with exact measurements if we cannot get it perfect? If we can never get the exact measurement, we could get around a rough estimate of the measurement, but not the exact measurement, which would seemingly invalidate the entire tabernacle. But then, where we discussed yesterday that Hashem does not desire angels. He does not desire perfect entities in order to do perfect things. The punchline, as we opened up from last week's classes, that makes the anecdote funny is a complete reversal of everything that was delivered thus far. And the punchline regarding the human condition is that although we are all limited and imperfect and blemished, nevertheless, each and every one of us are capable of thinking and saying and, of course, doing perfect things. And deeper than that, and this is where we concluded yesterday, is specifically in the lopsided aspects of our lives and the incongruencies that Hashem metes out to each and every one of us individually, is where our service applies. Asher bara Elokim la'asos, that Hashem created Elokim contractions in order for us to come and bring these contractions into their desired form. Rabbi Shabtai Kravitsky, the head shliach of Belgium, shared in a Verbrengen about 6 years ago that in Antwerp, where he is a shliach, happens to be one of the biggest diamond districts of Europe, and one of the biggest trade show for the entire year happens in Antwerp. He related that a week prior to the big trade show, a middle-aged man walked into his Chabad house on Shabbat while a Verbrengen was occurring, and Rav Shabtai invited him to the Verbrengen, started giving him l'chaim and tell him stories and so on and so forth, and the man got really enamored. One of the central points of discussion was the observance of Shabbos. And after taking a few l'chaims and listening to all the inspirational words and concepts, with a little coaxing from Reb Shabtai, the man agreed to keep Shabbat, at least one Shabbat. This was in the course of a Verbrengen after being plied with l'chaim. Well, it was a good idea during the Verbrengen. It's a marvelous concept, especially if it's explained correctly to a person who's never kept Shabbat. But once the effects of the l'chaim wears off, and the person returns back to their normal scheduled programming of the work week, this concept remains a nice inspiration, one that was in the back of his mind that he knew that he committed to. But he didn't pay attention to it until just a day before Shabbat. Because the day before Shabbat, he realized that this weekend happens to be the biggest trade show of the year, where the bulk of his income comes from. Now he is in the diamond district, surrounded by all of his competition. And it happens to be that Saturday is one of the biggest days for this convention. But then again, he remembered that he took upon himself to keep this Shabbat. The Friday night he comes to shul, but he doesn't discuss with the rabbi his apprehension. Shabbat day he comes to shul again, but this time he comes with a heaviness in him. The rabbi notices it but doesn't say a word. And he becomes as the morning progresses and early afternoon, he becomes more and more anxious. After the kiddush, the man sets to go home. Along the path to get to his home, he walks through the diamond district. And he sees a hustle and bustle that is happening along the strip. And all he could think about is how much money he's losing per hour. And he starts bargaining with God. He says, God, I know I told you I know I committed I'm going to keep this. But I completely forgot about this Shabbat. So how about I originally committed to keep one Shabbat? I will trade this one Shabbat for 51 other Shabbatot. Just not this Shabbat. And he proceeds to walk to his store. Every store is hustling and bustling except for his, which the gate and everything is shut. He comes to the gate to open it up. And he's about to open it up, but then walks away. After all, he did commit, and something inside himself is telling him, you've got to keep it. On the other hand, the animal soul and the Yetzer Hara are pushing and pushing and pushing. It's the way that only one's individual Yesahara and animal soul could push. As he walks away, he comes right back to it. And again, is about to open it and then walks away. And this repeats itself several times. Motzei Shabbat, the man comes to Chabad, to the Chabad house, and asks the rabbi for a tikkun, for correction. He felt genuinely guilty. And the rabbi asked him for what? He says, well, I came to shul today out of the commitment that I made last week, and I'm a man who stands by my word. However, while I didn't share this with you, Friday afternoon, I realized that the biggest trade show, I knew it, but I forgot about the conflict that I committed to keep this Shabbat. But then again, there's a trade show. I came to shul, and after shul, I walked down to the strip, and I was very, very tempted to open up my store. And was back and forth. And eventually I realized I'm not going to be able to withstand the temptation too much longer. So I ran home and drank a quarter bottle of vodka and passed out. And I woke up Motzei Shabbat. The rabbi was waiting for the punchline. What do you need a tikkun for? But that was the end of the narrative. So then the rabbi asks, so what do you need a tikkun? For what purpose? He says, well, Rabbi, last week when you were discussing Shabbat, it seemed like this heavenly state of being and to be aligned with yourself, with your thoughts, with your neshama, with your family, and with God. It's a spiritual oasis. I'll be honest with you, Rabbi, I didn't feel any of that. What I did feel is extreme anxiety and the feeling of financial loss and opportunity. I ran to the store, tried to open it. And I kept on going back and forth. And eventually, in order to make sure that I don't open the store, I ran home and got so drunk that I passed out. And that was a Shabbat. The rabbi said, but did you open the store or not? He says, no, I didn't. I ran home to get drunk, so I won't do it. So the rabbi said, so what do you need a tikkun for? He says, because the Shabbat that you described and the Shabbat that I experienced was not the same Shabbat. The rabbi understood the plight of this man and said, let me compare and contrast my Shabbat with your Shabbat. My Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, I go to the mikveh, I daven mincha, and then Kabbalat Shabbat, come home, we make kiddush, we share words, we discuss things that happen throughout the week, we discuss anecdotes, we make l'chaim, we sing nigunim. Shabbat morning, I wake up, it's Chassidus, and I go to shul, and then I daven, and then I speak, and then I verbring for hours, and then I come back home, and then we have the meal, and we continue the verbringing. Then there's mincha suda shlishit, and we learn, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's a magnificent Shabbat versus your Shabbat, which was anxiety riddled. Should I open it? Should I not open it? And then to top it off, you go and get drunk. So you'll pass out because the temptation is too much for you. Now, while on the surface level, my Shabbat seems to be much more illuminescent than yours and thereby superior to your Shabbat. But in Shamayim, in heaven, whose Shabbat do you think is more appreciated? The man responded immediately. I mean, from what you described, your Shabbat is truly magnificent. You're achieving the marker. You're achieving the goal. which is alignment. While mine, I was so misaligned throughout the entire Shabbat. He says you would think so logically. But I could guarantee you, the rabbi tells the man, that your Shabbat is magnificent, truly magnificent. Because my Shabbat, well, I grew up with Shabbat. It doesn't occur to me to deviate from Shabbat, to violate the Shabbat. There's no reality in my mind that would tempt me to break Shabbat. You had every reason, logical reason, especially that you weren't raised with it and you committed to it on L'chaim during a Farbrengen, not knowing all the circumstances, and the biggest trade show of the year, and a person lost to you, and yet, by hook and or by crook, you kept Shabbat. This Shabbat was truly for God. In other words, while the details themselves, if you compare and contrast the details of my Shabbat and your Shabbat, well, my details are perfect. And yours are greatly flawed. But if you look at it from Hashem's perspective, your Shabbat was truly holy. See, what usually impedes us, or the Yetzer Hara that impedes us, is feeling that if it's not perfect, then it's not real. Because the Yetzer Hara often makes us focus on the finished product, on the result. But that's a Yetzer Hara. Because as we discuss in many classes, we don't have command over the results, over the product. That's on Hashem. We have the command, for the most part, over the process. And for this reason, we were born, we were created. As the Mishnah says, Ani nivreiti l'shamesh, I was created to serve. In other words, the I is here to serve with all of its embellishments and all of its deficiencies and all of its incongruencies, but all of its strengths and abilities to utilize for the service. But to Hashem, it means everything. It truly means everything. For example, as children, we want to give our parents presents, but we don't have money, like Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, anniversaries. We want to give them, but we don't have money to give them. So we draw something. Or we ask, as a child, my brothers and I used to ask my parents for $1 because we didn't have too much money growing up. So we asked them for $1. We went down to Worldworth or whatever that is, one of those, and we bought a mug for $1.50. Now, obviously, the money came from them, and the present that we bought wasn't luxurious, but it's the best we could do with the means that we had. And Shabtai also in another Farbrengen related that when he was in the yeshiva in Yerushalayim, before he came to Chabad, he was in a yeshiva called Kol Torah. It's a very prestigious yeshiva. It's led by one of the greatest mind of the generation, Reb Zalman Auerbach. but it was a Lithuanian style yeshiva. In Lithuanian style yeshiva, the rabbis have what's called Musar Shmuzin, Musar talks. And one of the central points of discussions that the rabbis was really, really focused and stressed throughout their conversation with the students is how you must, each and every one of you must strive to be a Torah scholar. Nothing less. There was one particular student, Reb Shabtai related, that approached one of the Rabbanim who delivered that type of conversation and opened up his plight. Says, Rabbi, I would love nothing and I want nothing more than to be a Torah scholar. But my mind is dense. It doesn't pick up information like everybody else around me's mind. I watch in envy as all my peers sit and learn 12, 15 hours a day Talmud, and they go through pages and pages and commentaries and this and that. Well, I could barely go through 2-3 lines a day and understand it. I would love nothing more and want nothing more than to be a Torah scholar. But if Hashem wanted me to be a Torah scholar, then why did he make my mind so complicated? The rabbi told him, no, tishbor rosh, break your head. In other words, keep going, keep at it. And eventually you'll become a Torah scholar. He says, the student tells the rabbi, but Rabbi, I'm not talking about yesterday or a week ago. I'm talking about my entire life. I find myself constantly struggling with learning. And I feel increasingly frustrated because I don't feel I can become a Torah scholar. And therefore I feel very inadequate and very ashamed. The rabbi didn't really have an answer for him. If Shabtai heard this conversation between this young man and the rabbi, this was the period where Reb Shabtai started coming closer to Chabad. Reb Shlomo Chaim, Kesselman, and so on and so forth. And he pulls his friend aside and tells him, look, you've heard about the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Crown Heights. Write a letter to him and pose all your questions, your concerns. The Rebbe will have the answer for you. So that's what he did. He wrote a letter to the Rebbe. He says, Rebbe, if I'm meant to be a Torah scholar, why does Hashem make my mind so dense? And it brings so much disappointment in myself and my service to God. The Lubavitcher Rebbe writes a very powerful letter, replies with a very powerful letter. It says, I was shocked by your question. For nowhere in the Torah do we find a commandment to be a Torah scholar. Rather, the Torah emphasizes that I was created to serve my master. The aim is serving God. Some people get to serve God with many pages a day, and some get to serve with 3 lines, with a deep struggle. But how do you know, the Rebbe continues, that your 3 lines a day that comes with the struggle and through the struggle isn't more precious to Hashem than someone who naturally gets it perfect each time? And perhaps your 3 lines that come through struggle is far superior to theirs. The aim is not the product. The aim is a process. And each and every one of us are given those details in our processes that are unique to our neshamot, and the purpose for which the neshama descended to this world. So the aim is to think and say and do the most perfect thing that we can do. As the saying goes, Hashem does not expect us to serve him with what we don't have, but rather with what he endowed us with. The Yetzer Hara, on the other hand, will always focus us on what we don't have, with the logic behind it that either implies or downright screams at us that if we did have these things, or if these things, certain things wouldn't happen, then we could serve God perfectly, which is a complete deviation of our faith from to Hashem, which is the faith out of Hashem and to Hashem and anava and humility that is born out of this faith, is to understand that everything that we have is from God, and everything that we don't have is from God too. And Hashem wants us to serve him with exactly that. There was a man who walked by dollars, a Baal Tshuva who walked by dollars by the Rebbe. And in his brief interaction with the Rebbe, he bemoaned the very fact that more or less his honeymoon period with Judaism is gone. You know, when you start making tshuva, you're feeling as the best of the best, like you've figured everything out, like everything's perfect, you know. And just like in a marriage, you get married, everything seems like you made the right choice and everything, but then life starts happening, and then you start, you know. He says to the Rebbe, why, if Hashem wanted me to serve him in such a pristine way, why did Hashem now give the Yetzer Hara came back and this came back and all that? Why? For what purpose? Hashem, the Rebbe asks him, "What do you do professionally?" He says, "I'm an art, a fine art. I'm in fine arts. I own, I sell, etc." The Rebbe asks him, "Do you have a favorite painting?" He says, "Yes. There's a painting of a beach, a beach, and in the background there's an older couple, in the foreground there are children playing, and it contrasts and compares and contrasts generations and two generations, etc., etc." He says, the Rebbe asked him approximately how much is this painting worth. I think he said something to the tune of $5 million or something like that. And the Rebbe responds back with $5 million. You get a postcard for 15 cents with a picture of a beachfront with an older couple and a younger kids playing. And not only is it's more cost effective, but no matter how brilliant the painting is, it can never get a picture perfect. That's a camera. So why do people invest so much money in art when a picture is more cost effective and gets it perfect each time? And the Rebbe continues, he says, because while the painting doesn't get it picture perfect accurate, but the painting has a virtue that a picture, as perfect as it may be, can never get, which is the human experience. In other words, when a painter paints, an artist produces, they inject their entire life into it, everything they're going through, everything they went through, their parents, their siblings, their traumas, and everything. You're not seeing the Rebbe says, the exact scenario. You're seeing this scenario from the lens of a human being who lives life. To that end, the Rebbe says, so too in our world. There are angels, and they're akin to a camera. They get it perfect each time. There are no flaws. Hashem says, and they do. There's no ego, there's no human condition attached to it. There's no personal agenda. There are no limitations. And yet, in this world, we are Hashem's artists. In other words, our aim is not to get it perfect. Our aim is to reveal perfection through the lens of our imperfection. It's a perfect synergy. And so this also applies in marriages, in relationships. I just posted a chat. I posted on the relationship chat a conversation that my wife suggested an hour and a half into the conversation that we should record and share it for podcasts. So we recorded about an hour and 7 minutes of it. And we were talking about what Shalom Bayit looks like. And there were two modalities. She was discussing one modality, I was discussing another. And there was a question. We were discussing a particular case that came to me just recently. I was getting her opinion. And after listening for a few minutes, she said, "So let me understand. So and so is looking for safety in his marriage, which means that he doesn't want to be disrespected. He needs to be loved, and no matter what the turbulence is, the aim is to eliminate the egos, to sacrifice the egos in order to achieve Shalom Bayit." I said that no, that's not my analysis. What we're truly looking for in marriage is not safety in marriage. It's the safety of the marriage. And these are two different realities. Safety of the marriage implies that the marriage itself is the framework and the lens through which the couple interact at all times. And we compare and contrast that to our marriage to Hashem. We serve Hashem in the daytime and in the nighttime, in clarity and in confusion. Shabbat is not predicated upon the weather or upon sports events or lack of. Putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbat candles, giving tzedakah, eating kosher isn't a matter of convenience or inspiration or being in the mood. It's a service. And first and foremost, it's an obligation. And the more we respond to this obligation, the more it reveals who we really are. The commitment is there to reveal the core of the truth. In other words, a commitment is just a mechanics. Inasmuch as Chassidus explains, based on the Midrash of Eliyahu HaNavi, that the Bnei Israel's souls are superior to the Torah and originate from a higher place in the Torah. But as Chassidus explains, while that's absolutely truth, it's through the commitment and occupation with Torah and mitzvot that we reveal the essence of who we are. We reveal our superiority to the Torah. But it's only through Torah and mitzvot that we can achieve this. Safety in marriage means that we know that no matter what the settings, the inspiration or lack of, the emotional congruency or not, the values and the tenets and the obligation of the marriage will never deviate. In the mood or not, you communicate to each other, you compliment each other, you thank each other, all the things that we usually would shut down when we feel not safe in the marriage. But safety of the marriage means the definition of who we are and what we're here to do is marriage. And therefore, that's truth at all time. And Hashem guarantees us that with our marriage to Him, which is, Hashem tells us in the Torah, over and over in different places, in different sections of the Torah, Israel af al pi shechata Israel hu. A Jew, though he may sin, or he sinned, is nevertheless Jewish. In other words, the sin does not detract and cannot disrupt the essence of who you are and your definition. The imperfection can never complicate the truth, nor could it cover up the truth. It might create films around the truth, but it cannot deviate the truth. It cannot contort the truth. Before we went out of Egypt, Hashem deemed us His firstborn, Bli B'chor Israel, my firstborn Israel. And as the Tanya explains, that definition, my firstborn, means the firstborn is the one that received the essence of the parent. And when did Hashem tell us this? Not when we received the Torah or when we chanted unanimously, Nasa v'nishma, we'll do and then we'll listen. In other words, we accept you and your Torah blindly. In other words, Hashem didn't come and give us this compliment because we made Him proud. Hashem told us the truth when we were in the lowest, most depraved place in the world, in the most lowest and most depraved place in our consciousness. As well as regarding our reward, the Torah unequivocally says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek l'olam haba. All the Jewish people have a share in the world to come. In a very famous letter that the Rebbe wrote before he assumed the leadership, which is printed in Igros Kodesh, the Rebbe explained that this is quite literally every single Jew, and no matter how low the Jew could be, there's always going to be that redeeming factor that he's going to have a portion of the world to come. In other words, what Hashem is giving us is the framework of our marriage, safety of the marriage. He's saying us, no matter what you do, I'll never trade you for someone else. No matter how imperfect you think you are or the situation is, you're mine. And I'm yours. And no matter what happens throughout history, you have a share in the world to come. Now that that frame is put into place, and that's the base definition, now we're not afraid of imperfections. Because now we realized, from this truth, we realize that if we are experiencing imperfection and incongruencies, yes, and so on and so forth, that's just a piece of the puzzle that Hashem is sharing with us for us to come and work together with Him. What scares people from imperfection and not getting the product, the result perfect, is thinking that I'm not worth anything, that my service is not worth anything. If we're having congruencies in our relationship by humans, how much more so to Hashem, then it's not real, it's hypocritical. But that's exponentially far from the truth. Yeah, if you're having congruency, we got to work on it. Yes. And for that reason, there's incongruencies there. As we said, Hashem created contraction for us to come and do something about it. But it is specifically in responding to these congruencies where our value shines truthfully. For a limited human being it's entrenched in the human condition in the darkest period of all of history, the most confusing part of all of history. For this human being to come and do holy things, not because they're going to get paid more money, not because people are going to get mete out more glory and honor to them, not because they're going to even get respect, and not because their life is going to become so much more simpler if they just align with themselves with Judaism. Often we see just the opposite. Of course we have blessings. Of course we have miracles. As the saying goes, one could either live without everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle, but there's no in between. But at the same time, realize that the greater you are, the more complexity you're given. And that's perfection from Hashem's perspective. And for that reason, our souls descended into this world. Because again, if Hashem wanted perfect love and perfect awe, well, this world is certainly not the setting for it. In Shemaim, that's attainable. In heaven. And in an unobstructed, infinite, fertile ground, sure, of course, you could grow, your love could be magnificent in your awe, and so on and so forth. But then again, what's the value? What have you personally contributed? Nothing, you're just a benefactor. In this world, with all the obstructions and all the limitations and deceit, etc., one can innovate. And the innovation comes via the lens of that while I might be imperfect, but that in itself is the fertile ground to do perfect things. is because I didn't get it right, is because of the ability to fail, or perhaps failing in actuality, that I could learn from that and grow even greater than without the fail. And that's perfect. And go back to marriage, the same applies. And we discussed it somewhat yesterday. It's specifically when we start noticing each other's incongruencies, or with your children, or with your parents, is where the service really begins. The initial state of bliss is just the force of attraction. Where we really spend the majority of the time is in the disparaging, the differences that we have, the uniquenesses. And that also includes our personal unique triggers. So when they come out, we immediately start resenting because we say, well, this is not the person I married. But that's when the love starts its actualization process. That's when it moves from infatuation to reality. This is where you could gauge if it's truth or not. And love is being alignment. So if you're aligned with your body, when your body's aligned with itself, although each organ in itself and sinew is unique and has its own definition and its own unique way of processing life, it's all one body. And therefore, each part will compensate for a lack in somewhere else without complaining about it, without being angry about it. It might be more difficult. When I was a child, I fractured my leg in 3 different places. And I had to stay off this leg for 2 months. But, I was a very hyper kid and I did not like sitting all day. So I learned how to use crutches and how to stand on one leg. Now, when my cast was taken off 2 months later, the muscle withered away. And the heat from the cast also because of the heat, the leg was skinnier than not just a muscle definition, but also some of the fat. But at no point did it occur to me, because I had to stand on one leg, to start kicking my right leg with my left leg. Why do you put so much strain on me? Why can't you hold your part? Who told you to go get broken? Why do you get us into this situation? No. From that point, it's seamless. It's one body. If one leg has a deficiency, the other one leg immediately will kick in. It will take the brunt. It's not me versus you. There's an us. And where do you see this come out the most is in the deficiency times. That's where you see it really shine out. Now, in the safety of the marriage, the same applies. When you repeatedly see and understand that everything's intact, whether it's marriage between human spouses or with Hashem, we're told the framework is a framework. Nothing you could do will break through it. Now that you have that, you could start actually living. You could actually start doing without fear. And this is a gauge that a person really has to view themselves and really gauge how they understand life. If a person who analyzes themselves, views themselves, and notices a deficiency within their characteristics, or their thought, speech, or action, if the person is led by Yetzer Hara, by the evil inclination, they will go into panic mode, anxious mode, shutdown mode. They will start double guessing themselves. As we know, what's called the imposter syndrome. In other words, they will tell themselves, see, I'm really not, I'm a faker, and this is not me, I'm a nobody, I'm nothing, I don't have a chance. And when it comes to Yiddishkeit, a person will say, you see how far away I am from God. No matter how much I try to serve, I'm flawed. I'm just a flawed person. There's nothing else I could do about it. I'm a walking tragedy, and I'm a walking disaster. Says the Rebbe, just the opposite. It's because of the deficiencies that we're here. As we discussed a year ago, and we touched upon this point somewhat two lessons ago. Moshe Rabbeinu had to retrieve the Torah from Shemayim. Ultimately, what he proved to the angels, and they had to concede, is that the Torah was given to people with a Yetzer Hara. And that's our virtue. And they don't have this virtue of a Yetzer Hara, therefore the Torah is not for them. Our greatest virtue is specifically found in the deficiencies. When we notice that we're lopsided and so on and so forth, if something is not right and we have fragmentations, and as we discussed the other day from the Reb Nachman of Breslov, based on the Tehillim, "V'tachaser me'at me'elokim," as per Reb Nachman's interpretation of the verse, that the deficiency of the human condition stems from God Himself. That God Himself, as it were, is sharing His own deficiency, the deficiency that is born out of His desire for a dwelling place in the below. In other words, there has to be a below. There has to be a condition that He, as it were, cannot enter. Because if He would enter, if He would reveal Himself, if He would make it clear, then that's part of the above. The below only begins in a place where the above is no longer relevant, seemingly. It's not active. But that's when the human being comes into play. We are specifically driven to the below in order to open that place up for God. And not only open it up, but make Him comfortable in there. So from this conversation last night, one of the observations that I had was, well, if that's the case, then we don't have to sacrifice the egos. Because how much time could you say to yourself, well, I want to say something, something's bothering me, but I'm just going to shut up. Because that's my ego. Rather, discover what's in the depth, what's the spark that you're really looking for in that situation. And through the connection, through the discussions, and so on and so forth, respond to that and harmonize that with the marriage. Just like Hashem is giving us all the deficiencies, and He doesn't say ignore your humanity, your human condition, and it doesn't matter. He says learn how to utilize it. Learn what you're really looking for. And the reality is when Hashem gives us these deficiencies, as we discussed in one of our prior classes, this is in fact, as a Rebbe told a young man once by the dollars, this is literally our ladder upwards. Each one of the deficiencies, the trying times is a rung in the ladder. Whatever deficiencies we find within ourselves is only half of the story. What we do about it is the other half. It's specifically when we become aware of the deficiencies that should drive us to innovate, to grow, to create holiness in a place where seemingly it's impossible to have it. Because we know that when a person walks into the fog area of their life where things are not clear anymore and everything seems to be dark and gloomy, the animal soul will become scared. But Chassidus is telling us that when we walk into a foggy, gloomy place of our lives, that's our shlichus. That's the mission for which we were created. Because in order to deal with that section of our life, we can't just rely on our external abilities, our external talents, and soul talents, which are the intellect and emotions. We have to reach very deep inside of ourselves to the essence and the core of who we are. And think, talk, and act from that point. Because that's where our greatest treasures are found. And as we discussed in one of our several previous classes, when Moshe Rabbeinu approached to receive the Torah, what does the Torah say? Moshe nigash el harafel kisham Elokim. And Moshe approached the fog because over there is God. In other words, in the darkness in itself is where the mission is, where we will find the most reserved, the most intense and essential core of who we are, of how special and how holy and unique each and every one of us are. We need to internalize this. For once the framework, the safety of the marriage between us and God, between us and our missions, between us and our spouses, when that's set in and that framework is absolutely real, tried and tested, that reveals the courage to move forward. Because what usually gets us stuck is once we walk into that proverbial fog, the unclarity, is a fear, well, I don't see anymore. I don't see clarity. So imagine a person is walking on a scenic route and everything's beautiful, and all of a sudden nowhere, fog just sets in, and this fog is so dense that it's impossible to see more than a foot away. So obviously at that point, the person could be anxious. Now there's two choices. One is to remain steadfast until the fog is lifted. could be there for a while. But a more prudent response would be walk deliberately, pace yourself. Sure, it won't be as scenic as it was before. But first of all, it takes a lot of courage to walk in such a situation and to continue. And number two, it requires you to be so centered and so aligned and so deliberate with each step. And so aware. After Gimel Tammuz, 1994, I believe the very next week, Sunday Times, New York Times, had a spread on the Rebbe and the Rebbe's leadership, and so forth. I believe you could still see it online. And one of the predictions that they made was Chabad is going to more or less close shop very soon because the Rebbe is the engine of Chabad. The Rebbe's remarkable leadership is, as it says in Tehillim in chapter 90, Tefillah Moshe Ish Elokim. Prayer by Moshe, a godly man. And the Mefarshim explains is half man, half godliness. And the Rebbe explains this, that the neshama comes from where godliness openly revealed, so he has that kind of foresight. So you think with the absence of such a leader, the physical absence that is, well, logically everything is going to come to a screeching halt very soon. But in fact, and this is what the Rebbe taught us, you've seen the Rebbe's mission that he entrusted us with exponentially grow into every single platform, every single section of life, every different demographic. So that Sunday morning, Reb Mendel Futterfass was in Chabad Flatbush when I was making tshuva. With the shul, I started making my tshuva process. And he was there that morning, Sunday morning. And a lawyer by the name of Binyamin Eisenberg, although he himself was not grew up in Chabad, but he was very attracted to Chabad. He turned to Reb Mendel and says, Reb Mendel, now what? And without missing a beat, Reb Mendel says, now, nothing changed. The course is a course. The course of where we need to go to did not change. It just requires the essence of us to come out. In some summary, it's specifically in the incongruencies and the fog time and the gloominess of our lives where we're given the opportunity to reveal perfection. When we're given the privilege of being God's wife and his servant, his child, his friend. Hashem calls us different titles. Hashem also calls us his mother. There's different ways that we interact with God. But it's specifically in those times when we're able to reveal that essential connection and bond we have with Hashem. It's specifically in the dark times we're able to produce novelty, beauty that could have never been produced without this. Put it this way. When it's sunny outside, it's gorgeous, it's beauty, it's warm and life and vibrant. Sunny and warm. And what happens now, clouds cover the sky. If you look up here in Great Neck, although yesterday started cooling off, the days before were absolutely gorgeous. And now there's clouds. We know that above the clouds, the sun is shining. If you're flying in a plane, you're above the clouds, it's bright like a sunny day. But the clouds now block off the sun. But when the sun ray is able to penetrate through the cloud, through the water, now creates a rainbow. Beauty. Where beauty is not just one particular color, but rather an array of colors which blend and accentuate each other. So sun being chesed, yud kei vav kei, the clouds being gvura, elokim, and then kaptiferes, beauty, harmony. It's specifically in the ability to navigate from a point of truth, of definition, a framework that is immutable, that cannot be attacked, that cannot fall apart, that we're able to navigate utilizing the chesed and the gvura as a good, the most optimal and the least optimal, and create beauty through that. And if you think about it in the course of a marriage, we know that, for example, in psychology, they teach that people with anxious attachment often attract and marry people with avoidant attachment. We know the anxious pursues love because internally they don't believe that they can be loved. So no matter how much the person, their spouse, shows them love and plies them with love, deep inside they don't believe that this is truth, because the way that they were originally exposed to alignment and love from their parents. So they'll constantly pursue it, and often with anxiety to attach to this. While the avoidant is just the opposite. The avoidant learned to live life without emotions, because they were never given emotions. It's not safe. They could go through the motions of a relationship and really, really embed themselves in it, but not the emotions. They won't feel. It's too unsafe for them. And as soon as feelings come out, they start panicking. So they retract, which inevitably, seemingly forces the one with an anxious attachment to start pursuing more love, because it's just confirming the avoidance spouse, their avoidance and their fear of emotions is only confirmed to the anxious attachment, but the confirmation bias that I'm not lovable. And this is an infinite loop that they're going through, where the reality is each one is there to help the other heal. And while pursuing this healing and facilitating this healing, each one is healed and achieve their tikkun. So, for example, for the avoidant, their tikkun is to bring out their emotions, which is exactly what the anxious needs, which scares everyone, but it only scares because it doesn't feel perfect. It feels not safe. And the anxious needs to learn how to be more grounded and more safe and more deliberate and consistent. And that's their tikkun. In meeting out the healing, the individual, the unique tikkun of the one who's meeting it out is actually being accomplished. So without what we said prior, what we learned prior, this could be very scary for a couple. Because that only proves that we're not a perfect couple, that we're not a good couple, what the world calls a perfect couple. But the truth of the matter, no, you are the perfect couple for each other. Because in the deficiencies and incongruencies, you're achieving your tikkun in this world. So too applies in our missions in this world, in our day-to-day life of bringing Mashiach and disseminating the Torah. It's not if this one or that one wasn't here, or this one was here, or this, and now because of this, I can't. That's not the truth. Truth is, this is a setting that God meted out for you individually and made sure that this was your setting before the creation of the world happened. The perfection is your ability to navigate through this, although you're going to have to be much more deliberate and much more focused, et cetera, et cetera. But your perfection is navigating through this, not the results of this, but rather the process. Emir Hashem will continue this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
Shabbat shalom.
Rabbi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Thank you.